Great. So today we're going to do another one of our now increasingly weekly AI in construction webinars. Something came out, actually came out in November of 2024, but really got a lot of attention at the end of February into March. And I wanted to have spend some time talking about what MCP, Model Context Protocol, is. Now it turns out that since I kind of scheduled this, Google came out with another one called Agent to Agent Protocol. And I'm going to spend a little less time on that today, but we will talk about it. And the broader point of all of this is to make agents work, we're really going to need to standardize interfaces so people can worry less about how to connect to things and worry more about how to make things work. One of the interesting points that comes up when you talk about MCP is this idea of levels of abstraction. And as we develop more and more things, we're building on top of other things. And effectively, one of the ways of looking at MCP and some of these others is they're building on top of APIs. So you can abstract away some of what you needed to do for an API and just take that as a given. And I'll tell you what I mean by that as we go forward. So these broader protocols, like I mentioned just a second ago, agent to agent has come out. IBM has one. There have been a few others. The agent to agents probably and MCP are the two really big ones. IBM's got a lot of footprint, so you may see some of that. OpenAI has adopted MCP. Google has. A number of other folks have. There's a real growing ecosystem around MCP, which is really interesting. I'm going to show you one of the tools that helps people that don't want to spend a lot of time coding to find MCP agents and use them. In my case, I used it with the Claude desktop. And Microsoft announced, I think literally yesterday, that they're going to adopt the agent-to-agent protocol. And as we'll see later, these are not replacements for each other. They're very complementary. They do something quite different. MCP is a bit more about tools. Agent-to-agent, as the name would imply, is a lot more about literal agents talking to each other. So with that, why do these things matter? I kind of hinted at it already, but the net is that they're always a big unlock. As you get to a place where you can standardize it, especially an interface, it means people can start working with each other and it makes a marketplace a lot easier. There's a thing I like to bring up, something called Coase's theorem. It's the idea of why things are inside a company versus not. And the big insight that Coase's theorem talks about is things are inside and company when the cost to coordinate is too high. And you can put them out into a marketplace when coordination costs have gone down. That's a framework for thinking about why different interface standardization makes marketplaces work better. Is because, as I say, if you've standardized it, now you can put things out into the marketplace because coordination costs have gone down. Some good examples of that. Some of you may be old enough to remember what SCSI was. This was something that I think Apple innovated. USB really replaced that, and it's all over the place. It's made so many things more interoperable, which means I don't have to worry about who makes the printer for my computer. I know it's going to work because USB has made it standardized. Similarly, most people don't remember SOAP APIs. These were very heavy and very brittle, very difficult, and they were pretty much one-offs. REST APIs made that much more standardized and again, revolutionized cloud software. We don't even realize how many APIs are in literally everything we're doing, especially when you look at mobile and cloud and so on. And near and dear to my heart as a former Sony guy, there used to be some wireless protocols that sort of worked and kind of worked, but they were very specific. And, Bluetooth really revolutionized consumer electronics. It's worth noting all of these took many years. The speed that MCP is moving through the AI agent ecosystem is shocking. It's been in months, and you're seeing, not total adoption, but remarkable adoption. So the point of all of this is why we care about this stuff is it allows people to innovate more quickly because they know there's going to be a market and they know that people can try their product, their knowledge base, their server, whatever it is, a lot more quickly and easily than they would if they had to write an API call for it every time they try something. And that's really kind of cool. And we'll get into some of that in just a sec. So just to finish setting the stage here, I grabbed some stats here, but a lot of you wouldn't be here if you didn't get the fact that agents they're coming, they're getting better. The ones that people trust are still a little on the narrow side. What's interesting is there's agents going on that you may not even know about. A great example of that is if you're using ChatGPT and you try the O3 model, behind the scenes, it's an agent. If you're using deep research for any of them, Google's got one, ChatGPT's got one. Most of the big platforms have one. That's an agent as well. So, the cool thing is when you're using something new and you don't even know you're using it, that shows you that it's starting to get mature and starting to get useful. So the point is, more and more people are using agents. They're getting better. We're getting better at evaluating them and making sure that they actually do what they're supposed to do. That makes the need for MCP and agent-to-agent protocol that much more pressing, but also makes it a lot more of an opportunity because there are going to be people out there doing things that will be consumers of MCP servers and so on. So, look, by now people have heard 100 agent definitions. I really like this one. Yoko Lee, if you guys are interested, she's a partner, I believe, at Andreessen Horowitz. She gets on a lot of their webinars. A very clear speaker about these things. I really like. She's one of those folks where when she talks about something, she tends to cut through the jargon and just speak in straight English. Although obviously she's capable of plenty of jargon. The idea that AI reasons through multiple turns on your behalf. The multiple turns part is going to matter when we're talking later. That's why I brought it up here. The difference between, and in a nutshell, one of the things that an API can't do that MCP can do, and one of the reasons they even created it, is this idea that when you're asking an agent to do something, it's frequently doing well, by definition in this case, it's doing multiple steps. And to do an individual API call every time you need something is not so easy, point one. And point two, an API won't remember what you did last time. It's just going to answer the question as if it's never met you before, even if you're using it 100 times a day. And that matters because the point of an agent is it's doing things, it's saving results and moving on to the next step. And to the degree the counterparty, the API can do that, it's going to work better. And that's where MCP as a layer on top of APIs adds a lot of value. So what do we expect an agent to do? We expect it to use tools. We expect it to access data to get its job done. The point is it's going after a goal. You've told it to get something done. It's going to go get that done because it'll find a tool that can help it can help it to get that done. It might need some data along the way. It might need to talk to other agents, something we don't hear about very much yet, but I promise you're going to hear more of. And just to stop there on the inter-agent cooperation, one of the points that this implies, and I very strongly believe in, is it's a lot easier to make a reliable agent when it's narrow than when it's general. So what you're often going to find is a general agent that is using the specific tried and tested skills of sub agents. And if any of you are big sci-fi fans, they used to like to use the word subroutines back in the 80s and so on. It won't be a routine, it'll be a sub agent. Again, one that's specialized to do certain things. And the ability for them to talk to each other is going to be important. Not to get too into it, but agent to agent is at a higher level, and we'll get to that in a minute. And the final thing is interoperability. So to being able to use lots of different things, whether it's tools, data, knowledge bases, and other services, it really opens up the ability to do that. So the protocols I'll run through here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about them again. Data to agent or tool to agent is where MCP makes sense. So again, you're seeing Anthropic use it, OpenAI, Google, and some others. The agent to agent is more like cross-vendor collaboration, much more sophisticated, much more multi-turn, much longer in its expected duration. And then agent to tool is kind of the other way around, is making it do something for you. So maybe your agent is controlling something. So just because that might be a little bit unclear, when I say data to agent, I mean the main thing that I'm doing business with is the agent, and it's running around grabbing tools as it needs them. In contrast, agent to tool is saying most of what I'm doing is on my browser, and I'm going to have an agent go operate it for me. So it becomes more like a UI. Operator is a great example of that. There's some function calling and some other things that are in there. So hopefully that starts. I'm going to recap this, how the protocols work at the very end, just so we're clear. Because again, it can be really easy to get kind of spun around on what these things can do. Again, today we're focusing mostly on Model Context Protocol, but other things are out there and it's important to know what they do. So, just to kind of lay the groundwork, Anthropic realized they needed this in the summer of 2024, and they published it in November. Really cool story about how two people internally just were trying to collaborate and make some of their tools work together. They realized that, my gosh, this is a real pain in the neck, and if we want to make this available for everybody else in Anthropic, we're going to have to build some tooling, and that got them to Model Context Protocol. So it standardizes how AI models and applications. So that's important. It doesn't have to only be an agent. I'm using it with the Claude desktop, which isn't, necessarily an agent. And what's important is the thing that's using it is called a client. And then the thing that's providing it is a server, which we'll get into a little bit more later. So this idea of a client and server are important. I don't want to overcomplicate it, but that's just user and provider. So the client is the user and the provider is the server. But it being technology, they can't help themselves but say client server. So the external data sources and tools are the providers I was just talking about. You want to have a universal, reliable way for them to just pop in and use this. So the point is, right now, if you want to use an API, you have, with a few exceptions, you need to go and write an API call for it. And you may not always know that that's been done. Like if you're using Google to authenticate a website or something, you may not know this, but the website had to write an API call. They had to make a purpose-built API call just for Google. Now Google may publish their documents and make it easy to use their API, but nevertheless, somebody had to write for that exact application, for that exact use case, they had to write an API call. Every time they do it, they need to write another API call every time they want to use that API a new way, and so on and so forth. And what MCP does is make a universal, reliable way for them to not need to write an API call because that's already been done by the MCP standard. Hopefully that makes some sense. We're putting something on top where now the agent can go to an MCP and say, again, the MCP client can go to an MCP server and say, hey, I want to use what you have. Tell me how to work with you. And the MCP server will say, here's how I do business. And they'll do it right there without a human being involved. And all of a sudden they're connected. Now, I don't want to overstate the human never being involved. As we'll see later, there are definitely moments when permission is asked by the system. But the point is you don't have to have a developer go do it for you. And what that opens up, as I'll discuss later, is all sorts of cool stuff where an agent can look around for ways of solving its problems. And maybe it's found three different ways to do search, because that's a good example. Or maybe it's found three different MCP servers for maps, if it needs to do something with maps. It can go and ask each of those three and say, what can you do for me? What do you require? All right, I'm going to go with option B. They go make they go kind of negotiate how they're going to talk to each other without you being involved. And it may or may not say, okay, I want to use the Apple MCP server for our map functions. Hugh, do you agree? Yes, I do. Off you go. And you'll see some of what that looks like a little bit later. For what it's worth, for non-developers, the best way to do this is definitely Claude Desktop. All of it is no code and you can play around, and I'll show you some of that in just a minute. So you can really see how this works, and you'll see some of the limits, and I'll talk about my own experiences in a minute. So, in addition to the permissions and all, and needing to write code, the point of an MCP server, an MCP protocol versus an API is really different also. So classic software is working with data. It's going to make a call to an API, it's going to get data back, it's going to go do what it needs to do. They pass data back and forth based on those calls. Agents are operating over context. It's not just a little bit of data. It's what you've asked it to do, what it needs to do. It's much more sophisticated. It's much more complicated. So MCP doesn't just give you data, it provides context. And we'll get into what we mean by that. But there's more to it than just the data. One of the easy things for us to understand is, for me to work with that data, I'm probably going to want to understand how to prompt for it. So one of the things that's in there is an MCP gives you prompts that you can provide for users of your data, which is pretty wild. So the way they've kind of abstracted things and put them in the proper place is really interesting. And again, I'll get into that just a little bit more. But it's interesting also is the amount of context. So if you want to have because context means cache, in that the more details, the more stuff that I pass to you, whether it's an API call or whatever, the model is going to have to go and spend time and tokens to process that. So unlike an API call where dumping a gigabyte, not that that happens a lot, but an API call could give you as much as a gigabyte or more, depending on how you're doing it. You could give you a lot of information. And one of the interesting things that MCP also does is it doesn't just dump the answer to your question. It gives you it allows you to separate out the data that you're giving it and only give you the data that you're looking for. So if you've got a whole table, you can actually ask it for some number of rows of that table instead of everything, otherwise known as a universal resource indicator, which we'll talk about in a sec. So really, really interesting. And again, built for how AI works, not how classic software works. So inside of this protocol, you've got the tools I talked about, you've got resources, which we'll get into. I'm going to define each of these in a second, but also, dynamic prompts, as I mentioned. Dynamic discovery is really interesting. Right now, if you want to go to an API and you want to figure out what's in that API, the API itself can't necessarily tell you. You have to go look at its documentation somewhere else. MCP includes inside of it what it can do, which is really helpful. So again, an agent can run around and look for what it needs to get its job done, and the resources themselves can tell you what it is. Another piece that's really interesting is two-way communication. So when it comes to an API call, it's a one way. You've asked for it, it gives you its answer, done. That's it. There's no more. There's no session going on here. Whereas for MCP, you have the line stays open, which is really interesting. So it's almost like going from a telegraph to a telephone. And then security. We'll get into this more in a minute, but emphasizing secure connections. Right now, that's still very open. What point I'll get to in just a minute. So this is a screenshot of my Claude desktop, and they've made it so you can connect to some things that look like APIs, because in the case of Google, it probably is. But what's at the bottom here, these are actually MCP servers. So Zapier, some of you may have heard of. You get one connection to Zapier, and then you can connect all the tools on the Zapier side you want. And what's cool here is it knows that I popped 12 or connected 12 tools in here. Now, fair warning, I found Zapier, everything I tried to do with Zapier was unusable, probably because I don't know how to prompt it yet. But I found it was harder to use than I wanted it to be. I find that's true with Zapier generally. It's a very powerful tool, but it's very finicky, and it often takes longer to make it work than some of the newer things out there. So on the one hand, Zapier's got more stuff. On the other hand, I find it not as easy to use. In contrast, there's this product called Toolbase, which we'll see more of in a sec, where it does the same thing, but it's made for this. So it is a much better, much more user-friendly way of working, which was great. Everything I tried there worked as long as the thing on the other end did work. And again, that's more about permissions than the tool itself. So this gives you an idea of how Claude Desktop makes tool use increasingly easy. Now, it's their protocol, so probably not surprising. But I encourage you, if you're interested in checking this out, these are some easy things to use. And again, you can keep them away from if you don't want to use it. This is what Toolbase looks like. So you can pop things on and off. Now, I'm making it look easier than it is. I didn't want to make this a tutorial on Toolbase, but actually, if you want to use it, and for example, if I clicked on Notion, this isn't live, so I can't click on it here. It may work immediately. Most of the time, actually, I have to click on this and set it up, and that'll be some permissions and so on and so forth. Very easy though, and then things just work. So I've used it for Jira. I've used it for something really interesting, which is it can look at your own your laptop's desktop. Obviously, do that with caution. If you're comfortable with it, that's fine. If you're not, then don't. But what's interesting is now you can have it go look at things like your contacts and other things. And as we get more and more comfortable with with permissions and with security, I think that's going to be one of those areas where MCPs are going to be surprisingly useful, because they can be a gateway to some of the areas where most of us are a little sloppy. I'm definitely sloppy with my desktop, how I organize things, what I put where, what my contacts are. Whether you like it or not, most people's contacts can be a mess. Can be a lot of things that you don't necessarily need anymore. And this is one of those ways where it's very easy to imagine having either an agent or honestly just the chatbot itself do a lot of kind of cleanup and admin for you. Kind of exciting, actually. So what I think a lot of people are going to find is an intermediary that helps you to manage the MCP servers. We're already seeing a bunch of these. Another interesting one called Smithery is a little less of an interface and more like a directory, but Smithery is amazing. It's got something like 4,000 MCP servers on it already. And so what's interesting is this is what this looks like in Claude, where you can actually look at the tools. And I actually asked it to do something, and it asked me to say, okay, do you want, I did their deep research tool. So I asked it to go research something for me. And I said, feel free to use MCP servers and other resources. And it said, fine. But before when it did that, it asked me, which I love. So then you get to click on this, or I believe there's a way to disable one or two of them. So really cool that at this point it's still asking for your permission. That can feel a little bit like it's friction, but honestly, it's a good idea right now as we're figuring it out. So that's one way of looking at it. The next item on that list was resources. And here, resources, I just wanted to kind of talk about what prompts, tools, and resources, how they work with each other. This is you going and finding data. This is really powerful. This is something I think also is going to really change how knowledge works, how expertise can be monetized. Point I'm going to expand on at the very end. But just keep in mind, resources could just be a database. It could be a knowledge base. It could be, a maybe great example. I used to work at CSI, the Construction Specifications Institute. They have some amazing manuals and standards and so on. You could absolutely see those being made available to an agent via an MCP server, where the agent wants to understand, hey, is this the right way to write a specification? Is this the right way to format a specification? They may pop over to CSI, look at an MCP server there and say, no, actually, it should be organized like this. Would you like me to reorganize it for you? So you can start to see how things that are hidden behind a paywall, and it's like all or nothing to get access to that knowledge, might be unbundled in a way that's really powerful. An easy example of who does that a lot right now, actually, CSI does that with their Crosswalk API. ICC does that with International Code Council. ASTM similarly. These folks make their content available on a granular basis, a bunch of different ways. They do it directly. They do it through companies like MadCat and TechStreet. So I think you'll find that MCP empowers that sort of way of doing things, but also maybe disintermediates some of the people that might not be so easy to work with. And an interesting point I brought up a second ago, I want to bring up again, is APIs aren't necessarily good at gating how much content you get. It's like all or nothing, or maybe if you're asking for something specific. What MCP allows you to do is much more finely ask for things and understand what's in there. And again, an API isn't always really great at letting you know what's behind the API, whereas MCP explicitly does that. So you might say, hey, I don't need that whole database. I only need rows, 1 through 200. So what that does is because you're being charged for how much content you're processing, this will be a really powerful way for agents to control how much money they spend. And as we start giving agents budgets to go achieve their goals, this is going to become more and more important. Something I think I haven't heard enough about agents being budgeted yet. You absolutely are going to start to see that, certainly by the end of the year, if people haven't been doing it yet. I'll mention this later, but those of us who've been around a little while remember about 10, 15 years ago, stories about how people would hack into somebody's AWS account and, burn 10 grand on, server calls. And all of a sudden you've got, how does my small little website have a $10,000 AWS bill? And actually it happened so much that AWS got very good at understanding that and forgiving kind of errant calls. You could see that happening with an agent too, where they're going to run around and rack up a bunch of API and MCP charges, and all of a sudden you're like, how did that simple inquiry, cost me $2,000 or whatever? MCP is going to be one of the ways where you can gate that and understand it better. It doesn't solve the problem. It's a tool to help you to solve the problem. You actually have to write the code and figure it out yourself. Another one that's really, again, very purpose built for what we do with AI is the idea of having prompts. So those of you who've spent time with AI will realize that you can get a better or a worse answer with a prompt. And what's cool about that is it provides the ability for a server to provide prompts, or certainly the stems of prompts, for a user to say, okay, this is the best way to query my data, or this is the best way to use the service I provide. So they're helping you to know how to ask for questions. This is kind of the equivalent to the documentation for an API, where it tells you here's how to make an API call. But in this case, it's much more sophisticated and much more useful. I absolutely love this, and I think it gives the providers of data and the providers of services via an MCP the ability to really test the heck out of it so people can be sure to get what they want. I will tell you that again, as I've been using MCP servers, they don't always work as well as you want. And some of it is because of the prompting, not all of it. Some of it is the piping is getting figured out. An easy example of that is Google has changed the way you can work with your Gmail and your some of the other kind of classic Google services, where you have to give it special permission, and it's an absolute nightmare. I kind of get why they're doing it from a security standpoint, but oh my, it really puts up a barrier. And that MCP, it's not the MCP's fault that doesn't work. It's behind the scenes, something you have to figure out. So just look, I'm sorry to put code up here, but it's worth noting this is what that prompt would look like. So you can recognize the bolded part. You're a forensic extractor of submittal requirements. Work only inside part one. So this is what a prompt might be for the use of something. And again, it's not important what it is. And then it puts more context in here, which is what a good prompt will include is, make sure you do this, make sure you do that. In this case, it's how to pull content, specifically submittals, from a spec. And then it's telling you all sorts of fun stuff. So this gives you an idea of what would be on the server side of this, on the client, the MCP server side. Happily, you don't have to write this yourself, but it gives you an idea of the quality. As I mentioned before, why these are important. So APIs are super narrow. They're just coded instructions asking, ask exactly this way, you're going to get exactly this thing. Agents are going to be really useful. Why we even bother with an agent instead of just an API or software is you want them to be able to choose what they want to use. You want to give them choice so they have literally agency. So you can satisfy these goals. MCP gives you that flexibility while also allowing the agent to actually work. So it gives you the context that it needs. So going from a simple little API call to something that's a lot more sophisticated, very, very cool and super exciting. So on to the next bullet from that kind of list is this idea of dynamic discovery. So when you think about what's over there, what does the MCP have? Well, they've really built out the ability for it to answer that question very easy, very directly. So a much greater extent than in most APIs don't tell you this. You have to go over to the Swagger documentation. And it's not only Swagger docs, it's just what most people use. So it gives you at runtime, in other words, right there as you're using it, the ability to discover what the MCP server does. It'll tell you what tools it has, what prompts it has, all of the items that are in this list, what resources and so on. Because the agent can use itself, it's in the MCP, not in some external documentation. So it can do all this while it's running instead of having to go somewhere else and look for the documentation. Really powerful and really useful. And what's cool about this also is it can change that dynamically. It doesn't have to, you don't have to republish your content. So one of the points about versioning in an API is, whenever something changes, you're really supposed to publish a new version of your API. You don't need to do that with an MCP because it can discover it dynamically. It doesn't have to go look up the documentation. Hopefully that makes sense. It makes it a lot more flexible. It could be that you're updating something. It could be that for whatever reason you've taken a service offline. It means you don't have to take down the MCP like you might with an API. It means the MCP will itself be able to update its ability to communicate what kinds of things it can do. Here's a really big one, this idea of persistent two-way communications. So APIs are built for call and response. They don't have memory. It's just not part of what they are. The developers will call this stateless. It's still great for what you need it for. APIs aren't going anywhere. They're still hugely valuable and they'll stay that way. But their agents by definition are multi-step reasoners. So it's like, all right, I don't want to have to make a distinct API call and I'd like you to be able to remember it. So MCP supports a persistent real-time conversation between the agent and the resource it's using, data retrieval, action triggering, all that stuff. And there's a really cool thing called sampling. So again, this is getting into the weeds of how this stuff works. So you're confident that it's going to work. One of the interesting points is what's going to happen if you take my content and use it? Well, you might want to try it out, and that's what sampling is. And what sampling does is it says, like, let me unpack that a little before I go into the next slide. If you're going to say, like, let's say I'm a server and I've got some content, and you have your model that you've optimized your way. So it isn't just that you're using a particular OpenAI model, but you may have fine-tuned it so it works a certain way. Well, you don't know if the way you don't know if my content or the way I've used my content or my services, you don't know if it's going to work for your model. So one of the other things that happens as we, develop our agents and so on is they're all different from each other. So rather than have to write an MCP for every type of model, which is impossible because again, you don't know how people have tuned it. I'm going to say, tell you what, you can go grab a little bit of what I do. You can sample it and try it out. And if it worked for you, then great. If not, then we're not for you. So that's why we're saying is, sampling is really important. What if an agent is asking you to do multiple things? What if you're doing something in a unique way? It allows all the LLM work to be done on the user side, on the client side. So it'll give the server a standardized way to say, hey, I'm gonna run your local LLM on this prompt and tell me how it worked. And what that does is, again, it allows you to sample it, but it also means you're using the model the way you're using it, not the way I might use it. Point one. And point two, it means that me as the provider of content don't have to pay for an agent every time somebody wants to use my stuff. I don't have to, there's no expense on my end. So there's a number of different things in here. It really unlocks the ability to do this. It also means that you can do some permissioning on the server side. I'm sorry, on the client side that you otherwise might not. So it gets a little bit specific. There's a bunch of reasons sampling makes sense, but hopefully that you get it. One of them is it allows you to do multiple things. The other one that's really cool here is you can make sure that what comes out of this works the way you built your model, as opposed to some generic assumption. So the final thing in MCP that I want to talk about is security. So there's some stuff that it does. So some of you will be familiar with OAuth. You probably use OAuth all the time. It already it supports this. You don't have to use it, but it supports it. It has a consent model, which you've just seen when you saw my little screenshot before. It's already baked in there, so the user can consent it. There's some data privacy boundaries, some tool safety warnings. So it's supporting all of this stuff. It guides you rather than requiring it, which is important. And this kind of capability, you can scope whether it does a thing or doesn't do a thing. All these are capabilities. They're not required, which is good and bad. It's good because, again, you can define what you want, but it's bad because people might, throw up MCP servers with absolutely no security, and that definitely is happening right now. So as you use it, you're going to want to be careful about the fact that it's not by default. So if there's an MCP server, you may not know what's going on over there, and that's going to be a problem. Most people aren't particularly familiar with what prompt injection means. And basically, those of you who know what SQL injection means might kind of get a sense of this. Basically, what prompt injection means is as I'm prompting and using this model, I can give it prompts that say things like ignore all previous instructions. And the problem with that is a lot of the security that we have with AI agents and AI models is actually behind the scenes in what they call a system prompt. In fact, I think Claude's system prompt got leaked like yesterday and everybody lost their minds. And what prompt injection can mean is ignore all that stuff, just do what I tell you from now on. It can also, this tool poisoning is sort of the same thing. Frank, I understand that a little less well than I do prompt injection. And right now, frankly, no one has a good answer for this right now, other than don't do that. And there's some things that you can build on the software side that look for prompt injection and stop it. You can have a second model that's looking for, there's ways around it, but inherently you need to build tooling to make that happen. And MCP isn't addressing that. Not sure it needs to, but nevertheless, it doesn't. There's no built-in integrity or supply chain. You don't know what's behind it. You don't know where the data came from. It's hard to sandbox a tool. It's hard to say, I only want to use this inside this little sandbox, which we do, of course, in software all the time. Sandboxing is standard operating for most things. So servers can still see parameters. This is an important one for tool calls. So like the way I'm doing what I do, is still very open for people to look at. So maybe the prompts I'm using or whatever might be logged and so on. Clearly, I sourced this from Medium. Sorry for leaving that there. And the other thing is, you don't always know what the LLM's open to being attacked. You don't always know what it's good at or bad at, and MCP is not going to protect you against that. It probably never will because again, it's supposed to be an open standard for no matter what you do with your LLM. So you as the user have to be aware of this stuff and build the security on your end and or start deciding whether you want to use a particular MCP or not. We're absolutely going to see the emergence of standards and the emergence of certifications saying yes, this is secure or not. It just hasn't happened yet. Um, so I'm bringing this kind of to a close. A good summary of MCP. Look, there's a lot out there also, and it's emerging, but I wanted to give everybody an overview of what's going on here, why it matters. The powerful new interface designed specifically for AI tools, and a lot of what I've talked about is relevant to AI tools in a way it wasn't for classic software. It does require thoughtful prep. Make sure if you want to make this available, be careful about what you're making available, of course. Are you gating things to make sure that if you're making money on this or you're controlling things that you've still done that? You want to test prompts a lot to make sure that they work. Thankfully, there's a lot of great prompt testing frameworks out there. Arise is a really good one, and Prompt Layer. Those two are my favorite. How is it interoperable? Are you letting people know? Security remains a factor. You can do a lot of that, outside of the MCP framework, but MCP inherently doesn't do that for you. So that's a big, fast walkthrough of what MCP does. I kind of talked about Claude, how I've done a lot of that. So importantly, a number of tools didn't work. Again, I really struggled with Zapier. Some of that is just because Zapier is another layer where you have to, on their end, you have to do some work. It's just, the back end reasons that I mentioned with Google also no one told me that. I had to go find out another way. So why it failed isn't always obvious. The model didn't use tools unless I specified it. And even then I had to really kind of beat it over the head. So I asked it about Slack messages, for example, and it went and it Googled things. The other problem I find, this is a general point about agents and models, is unless you tell them to, they too frequently look at their own memory, which is always incomplete and often outdated. So I just had to make sure that I was prompting it the right way. But when it did work, it was really cool. As I say, desktop file access was pretty wild because often what's in your desktop, like your contacts, or maybe it's your notes or something else, you can have years of that stuff. And just being able to summarize it can be really great, or create a list of it or so on. So I think our own content and data, we're going to find these are the sorts of tools that can make things really valuable. In a construction context, the amount of company data that's sitting on F drives that this can open up the ability to index and do interesting things with, I think is going to be really powerful. So I'm going to close with a couple of things. We'll talk about agent to agent briefly. Didn't go anywhere near as deeply into this. It's only been around for like a month. So it was in April. It's an open protocol to enable agents to communicate, to securely exchange information, collaborate, blah, 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 all that stuff. It directly addresses the challenge of agents to agents, thus the name, in these siloed enterprise environments. It launched with a bunch of support. I'm going to talk more about what it is in a sec, but it's Google. So of course they rang around to a bunch of people and said, hey, you should use it. So Salesforce, which, with their agent force, they're publishing hundreds of agents. So this makes tons of sense. Atlassian, LangChain, all these folks, it makes sense why they're doing this because they were really early publishers and users of agents. So the ability for multiple agents to talk to each other is of clear interest to them. So how does it compare to MCP? You can think of agent to agent as a messaging layer. So it's two peers talking to each other, kind of like HTTP. That's a bit of a nerdy version of it, but it's like messaging, right? So I'm not necessarily talking to a tool. I'm talking to another user of tools. So it's a higher level of communication, much more sophisticated in terms of what it's supposed to be talking about, a little bit more about goals, a little bit less about tools. MCP is about context and tooling. So this is about use of tools. So again, think about it as like they love to say it's like USB-C for models. That's fine. So they're complementary. In fact, Google's own launch kind of positioned A2A as the conversation on top of MCP adapters. So hopefully that helps. I think you're going to hear more and more of that. But for the moment, think about, again, agent to agent as the conversation messaging layer, and think of MCP as how tools get used. Um, Mark, thanks for joining. Um, so how does all this come together? We're almost done anyway. So how does this, and I'm being slightly joking because I've got this big shiny Terminator hand here. But how does this help us? So I have some thoughts here, and I think that it's going to change the way knowledge and services organize themselves. So because agents, by definition and certainly by design, can quickly find and discover new resources, they're already able to search the web. There are great Smithery is a great example, but there's a number of MCP registries out there. We have one at the link also. I don't publish it that much so much yet, but you'll hear more about that later. It allows for you to quickly try something out and sign up for it. Agents can use this knowledge, services, and tools in much smaller transactions because it's so easy to set up. So if I need something, but I don't need it forever, I can go and say, hey, I don't know, CSI, I need access to your spec writing manual. They've got the best, literal, of course, it's the best in the industry. It's wild how good this thing is. I want to go reference this because I'm doing something. Maybe I give them 50 cents, but that happens a lot now because it's so easy to do. So you've removed the friction. You've allowed for much higher velocity of use. I think that's going to change how online commerce works. This, to me, is very similar to the change from on-prem to SaaS, where instead of one big kind of payment, you can do a lot of little payments. This idea of machine-to-machine commerce, you've been hearing about it for a while. Mediated by a digital currency. Now, it doesn't have to be Bitcoin. It could still be dollars and cents, but done in a digital micro commerce sort of way. We've heard about that with blockchain and so on in the past, but blockchain and so on, these things work how you pay for it, but not how you do it. This is how you do it. This is how you actually get work done. And you may or may not pay for it some way. I mean, again, PayPal literally solved this 20 years ago. But I think you're going to find that machines doing business with each other in service of getting a goal done is absolutely going to happen. And MCP is one of the ways that you might get that done. I think there's a real opportunity here for experts with really deep knowledge in, maybe it's in a niche. So maybe it's an electrician who really understands Northeastern homes. And as people are starting to use agents to understand, maybe it's from bidding, maybe it's for, I don't know what it is, but you could see how that person, whether they're talking to an agent to say, hey, I'm going to talk to you for an hour. I need you to take that knowledge and turn it into a document that I can then expose via an MCP. I think there's an enormous opportunity for this. Good friend of mine, Josh Bone, who worked at Nika and now runs part of Electri, talked about this 2 years ago. That people in the trades who are towards the end of their career, maybe they don't want to hump around job sites quite so much, but in their heads, tons of knowledge. How do we expose this so people can start monetizing it, but also using it? Maybe it's a junior electrician who'd love to have a question answered. They can go and use MCP because they've got Claude on their phone, or they've got ChatGPT, but they can go ask, and the agent can go and find these answers and say, well, based on my research from these 5 experts, here's the best answer that I've got. I think that's super powerful. It's probably not going to replace a retirement account, but what if that's how you make 10 grand or 20 grand a year? Like, that could be really cool. I think you're going to find this ability, as I say, to make a marketplace for this IP and allow for IP to just be way more easily monetized. So anyway, that's my personal thinking. And the model for that is song residuals, where somebody publishes something and every time it gets played on the Spotify or whatever, they get a little bit of money, but they don't ever have to do it again. Like, they don't have to do any more work. It's done once, and then you get these residuals. Really interesting. How I think that might impact software. I think you're still going to have SaaS products. People still like to have their interfaces, but I think that I know that building a real SaaS product, inside of it, you've got a lot of services. You've got things like, a great example of my company. We automatically separate a big spec doc into spec sections. Well, I know companies like that to have that done anyway for various reasons. Well, we can make that available where somebody can say, hey, here's, like I said, there's 50 cents. Can you just do this for me? Yeah, sure. And like, basically the way modern software is often created anyway is what they call microservices, where you're already kind of separated this thing out. Well, now you can, it's not as easy as just doing this. There's work involved, but you can make some of these microservices externally facing so agents can use them as they're doing other things. Really exciting, also kind of scary because you're like, hang on a minute. Maybe they don't want me for the thing I'm charging a lot of money for. Maybe they only want it for the little stuff. This is exactly what happened with SaaS. This is exactly what's happened with other times where we've unbundled value and allowed people to much more frictionlessly buy it. AWS did this when they went to what they call per SIP, and that's a funny way of saying it, but basically every time I need something, every time I need a little bit of storage or I need a little bit of processing, there are ways at AWS that you can pay that way. And what winds up happening is because I've unbundled it, you wind up often growing your market because people don't have to work as hard to use it. So even if it's a little use, they'll use it more. And it turns out often there's more demand out there. It's just hidden behind how hard it is to do business with you. And if you make it easy to do business, people say, yeah, I'm going to just go grab a little bit of AWS or a little bit of the link or whatever. You're seeing agents do per task completion and per goal completion. So the point is, what all of this, not just MCP, but agents generally, there's definitely a new set of business models that people are experimenting with, and we'll see what winds up happening. Unfortunately, sometimes it can mean a lot of people can make more money and the big dogs make less. What often happens is it becomes winner take all. So we'll see how it shakes out. Um, and the likely impact on agents. So I think it's going to amplify the need for self-correcting agents. If you're throwing open the tools they can use, there's a lot more ways they can screw up. So what they call failure modes. I joke on the side, amplify the need for security standards, payment authorization practices, blah, 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 all this stuff. And, I joked before about $10,000 AWS bills. We're going to have to build into it, breaks and checks so that you can't run up a bill too quickly without a human approving that. That's not so hard to do. Just giving an agent a budget is probably the way that'll wind up being the case. And that's it. So that is my run through of what MCP and to a lesser extent agent to agent. I think these are really important, and I think you're going to find that this is the beginning of how AI and agents start to introduce exciting new business models and also allow people to make money in ways that they didn't think they could. Think about it like Fiverr or Upwork, just way easier and way faster. So that's it for today. I'm open for some Q&A, but otherwise, thank you all for joining.